you have just started the University of Wyoming Bitcoin Research Institute. You announced it at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. Can you talk a little bit about why you started it? What is some of it a response to just kind of some of the garbage that was out there in academic texts, as far as, or I don't even know if you can call them academic texts, like the Mora et al.'s, and why did you decide to start this? Why was this necessary? What was the fire that you decided, this needed to be done?
That is roughly 1/3 of the problem, is the Mora et al.'s of the world. And there aren't a ton of them, but the ones that there are, a lot of them have been picked up and repeated and cited. So for those of your listeners who might not know, in 2018, Camilo Mora published a paper written by his undergraduate students in the journal Nature Climate Change, which is a nature journal, which is the pinnacle. Nature and Science are like the two top scientific journals. So this is a nature journal, Nature Climate Change, entitled "Bitcoin Emissions Alone Could Push Global Warming Above 2 Degrees." So most people think 1.2 degrees of warming would be disastrous. If Bitcoin's doing 2 degrees all by itself, then, we're screwed. And as you start reading the paper, which you do when you're an academic researcher, like we're trying to read all the papers. This has been cited over 500 times in other scientific papers. And you get things like, if its rate of adoption follows broadly used technologies, it could create an electricity demand capable of producing enough emissions to exceed 2 degrees of warming. So if it's adopted at a certain rate, then the energy use is going to go up at a comparable rate. Well, so problem number one, blocks are already filled. And adoption going up isn't going to make blocks more full than they already are. So you learn Mora et al. Doesn't understand there's a block size cap. Mora et al. Thinks that miners will spin up more and more energy use to chase the block rewards, because they don't realize that the block rewards only come every 10 minutes. They also don't realize that there's a difficulty adjustment. So it's not like they can come faster and faster and more Bitcoin can be issued. And so these assumptions are all leading to this conclusion that Bitcoin could exacerbate global climate change. And it's just because these people don't understand the Bitcoin protocol. They wrote up this paper as undergrads. They were worried about Bitcoin mining. They also didn't look very carefully at what kind of energy Bitcoin is using, and they didn't extrapolate out what kind of energy it might be using, right? So Troy Cross makes this argument all the time that, and I think he and Margot Paez's new paper is called, I think in the title, "Bitcoin is a Dung Beetle." And the idea is basically that Bitcoin miners are always going to be chasing the cheapest electricity because it's location agnostic. All you need is a pretty weak satellite internet connection. And so as it gets more and more competitive to mine, miners are going to be pushed more and more to these other sources of energy. So there's at least 4 assumptions in Mora et al. That most Bitcoiners know are fallacious, and 3 that basically we all know about the block size cap. We all know about the difficulty adjustment. We all know about the target block times. So we're reading more and more papers like this. We're reading papers that don't make mention of the Lightning Network when they talk about how many Bitcoin transactions can happen. Or they don't talk about layer 2s at all. They're comparing Bitcoin to Visa rather than comparing Bitcoin to Swift or Fedwire or something. So over and over again, we just saw pretty elementary errors by researchers who, to take a charitable interpretation, are making mistakes. We're pretty convinced that some researchers are not just making mistakes. They're invested in misinformation about Bitcoin becoming well-known and widely distributed. And I don't think we can necessarily do anything about that other than make the case so overwhelmingly to everyone else that these people are just one of the many voices. And right now they're too loud of voices. So the Bitcoin Research Institute came about, one, as a way of helping the Mora et al.'s of the world to vet their research beforehand, so as to make sure that they're not making these really basic mistakes. That paper has 3 responses that are published alongside it, pointing out some of these problems and other problems. And then 2, to solve a different problem. The other problem is that there are a lot of people who want to work on Bitcoin, we theorize, who are in grad school or even untenured academics. And there's just no incentive for them to do that. They can't find advisors to work with who understand Bitcoin. They won't approve Bitcoin projects. And it makes sense for advisors to try to keep their advisees working on things that they can actually advise about. So it's intellectually responsible for an advisor to say, I just don't know enough about this thing for you to work on it. And so we want to help those people to be able to do Bitcoin projects. And if they can't do it and be incentivized where they are, we want to provide them another incentive. And that incentive is money and time with Bitcoiners. So come to Laramie, hang out in the summer at our workshop, and talk to other Bitcoiners, develop some collaborations, and have a community, and do it for free. So we think that we'll be able to help quite a lot of Bitcoin research by bringing these Bitcoiners out of the closet, and also by helping the people who aren't Bitcoiners but do want to work on Bitcoin topics make sure that they don't make mistakes.
So first of all, I love the idea, and now I have a couple of excellent questions posed by your colleague Andrew.
I saw this.
That I would be remiss if I did not ask, because of course they are very well thought out, as only a professor of philosophy could do. But how do you answer the charge that the Bitcoin Research Institute merely exists to promote and indeed to academically whitewash Bitcoin? What are people who say things like this missing?
A few things. I mean, one is this is still governed by the same standards of, academic integrity that we do anything else in, which is you give arguments and you follow the conclusions of those arguments where they go. So the book we started without a conclusion, right? We don't know where this is going to go. In fact, we ended up being much harsher in the privacy chapter than we expected to be on Bitcoin, because it turns out that while Bitcoin has a similar degree of privacy to physical cash, it could be and should be better. So we were prepared to argue for any number of theses, depending on what the research and what the argument showed. And in the end, we thought the argument showed that Bitcoin was good for the world. And so it's the same thing with academic research. We're not only going to sponsor academic research that has the conclusion that Bitcoin is good. We're going to sponsor academic research about Bitcoin that tells the truth. And in some cases, the truth might not be something that Bitcoiners want to hear. We think that in general, it will be, and that as more research has been done, that's been borne out. But it's also the case that people should be allowed to work on what they're interested in. So imagine like a Center for American Democracy, where you're researching democracy. You have a stake in being right about that. And it would be ridiculous to say, well, you shouldn't work on American democracy if you're living in America or if you're pro-democracy. You have to be more neutral about that. Or Ibram X. Kendi has a Center for Anti-Racist Studies. Should you say that you can't be anti-racist if you're participating in that, or you can't be black? That would seem ridiculous. It makes sense for people who understand this to have a view about it, and then it makes sense for people who have a view about it to participate in these kinds of activities. So I think it's always open to us to change our minds about Bitcoin, and research might do that. But if it doesn't, I don't think that shows that the research is illegitimate.
I would agree with that, and thank Andrew for the question as well. And I feel like I need to ask another Andrew question, because I think this one, again, he's doing all of my hard work for me here. So thank you, Andrew. But why not a cryptocurrency research institute? or a Dogecoin Research Institute? Isn't it unfair and sort of weird to select Bitcoin for a special focus out of so many cryptocurrencies?
Well, you could have however many tens of thousands of research institutes if you wanted to do one for each cryptocurrency. So we're not an anti-Dogecoin research institute. We don't have the bandwidth to be anti all the other cryptocurrencies. So I guess it's open to someone else who believes in the power of Dogecoin to do something like that. We work on Bitcoin because we believe in Bitcoin, and we wrote this book. And so that's why we started a Bitcoin Research Institute. We didn't start a cryptocurrency research institute, I think, because a couple of reasons. One, the University of Wyoming already has a Center for Blockchain and Digital Innovation that was partly funded by Charles Hoskinson of Cardano, Ada. And they do research in a lot of other cryptocurrencies and a lot of other blockchain applications. And it's primarily, so we're an institute, they're a center. It's primarily practical, project focused, student teaching focused. And we think that there's not that much that unify cryptocurrencies. There is a lot of different consensus mechanisms. There's a lot of different methods of dispersal of the minted tokens. And we think Bitcoin is unique among those. Our last two presentations at the Bitcoin Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. Were about what makes Bitcoin unique among cryptocurrencies. So it's put on by the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And the first question is, why did we need this in addition to the Blockchain Association and Coin Center? And one of the reasons, I think the main reason, is that Bitcoin is neutral. And these other cryptocurrencies are not. They have insiders, whether it's founders, whether it's boards, whether it's companies. They have methods of beginning and distributing tokens that Bitcoin doesn't have. From the very beginning, Bitcoin was awarded via proof of work, via miners winning competitions. And even Satoshi was participating, made that competition open to anyone from the very beginning. So I think Bitcoin is a neutral internet money, and that these other projects aren't. And so you could have centers for, neutral computing and argue that that's what Ethereum is. It's a sort of neutral computer. But I think Bitcoin is unique, and that's why it's worth studying and having its own research institute.